Like to be introduced? Seriously, before we have this discussion, if you don't mind, I'm gonna change this one more time to make sure that this is working appropriately. Good. Before we do this, I've got about 20 minutes, and I'm going to spend most of the time talking about the state of the industry. And I'm going to give you some facts, and I'm going to dispel some myths, if you will, and I'm going to talk about what I think what I believe is the core issue that underlies the decline of sailing as a pastime. But more than any of that, what I'd like to suggest is that I'm going to offer some things that you can do. I'm not here to help you sell boats. That wasn't the premise of this book or the project at all. But I can help you make some choices. Before we do that, I want to thank some people. I've had a great time the last couple of years writing this book and traveling around the world talking about it. Actually, before it came out, Jonathan and Sally have been big supporters. John Art, George Day, Bill Mosier, Craig Lewick, John Kretschmer, Brian Hancock, Scott Tempesta, Alistair Murray, who's not here, who was kind enough to invite me to Paris in December. If you were there, it was a wonderful time. Tim Kent, Bill Goggins, of course, who's been a big inspiration to this. And of course the Shannon family, who about 25 years ago let me go sailing with them a couple times, and it really did change my life. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about this project. What to expect. Again, I'm not here to help you sell boats, but I am here to help understand what this is all really about. And does anybody have a knife? Please put it away, because I'm going to show you some data. So if you can see the screen, and you may not be able to in the back, so I'll try to describe it best I can, but this is sailing in the United States from 1949 to 2009. The green chart as it rises is the US population rising from about 150 million to about 300 million people. And the red line that looks a little bit like the Prudential Mountain, you know, the mountain from the commercial, shows us peaking in 1979 at about 12.5 million sailors, and then dropping precipitously to about 2.6 million sailors in 2009. This is really the state of the state. This is population on two charts, and you can see something went wrong because we weren't tapping from the folks that were deciding to become Americans during the period of time between 1979 and 2009. And this comes from all sorts of different sources. I'll make sure you have these presentations so you can see the sources. But I'd like to talk a little bit more about who's behind this, who's in this group that we have today, the 2.6 million. So, a couple things. Raise your hand if you're a sailor, please. Oh, wow. Okay, raise your hand if you're a parent. Very good. Does anybody not have their hand up when they raise it? Okay, raise your hand if you're a child. Okay, not you, George. Well, what we're going to do with this chart really quickly is we're going to talk about sailors by age group at this moment in time. And here we are. So what's happening here, if you can't see it, is the chart shows on the left-hand side 17 and younger. And then there's a group 18 to 25 or so, and then there's a group 25 to 36 or so. Basically, it's by stage of life, and I'm going to name them for you. About 13% of sailors are kids in high school. And then about 8% of sailors are 18 to 24 years old, maybe going to college. And then they quit, period. And don't sail. Only 8% of sailors are between 25 and 35, and then 35 and 45. And then all of a sudden, when you get to be my age, you get to be a sailor. And so about 60% of us are between the ages of about 45 and 65 years old. So who's between 45 and 65 years old? Point taken. Did they not invite anybody younger than 45? Well, here's the bad news. This is the U.S. population against those same metrics. So what you can see here is that about 28% of the U.S. population is under the age of 17. Didn't think so, huh? Well, the reason is, what's happened in the between 79 and 2009, that about 75 million people joined us in this country, and most of the people who did are parents and young kids. Surprising. Most of us think that boomers are that big group, and that's the way the population is moving. And you would think, this was a little surprising to me, you would think that basically when we're done, there won't be any US anymore, but that's really not true. So let's look at the data a little further. What I'd like to do is I'd like to zero in on us. This is a selfish moment. Here we are. I just turned 47. And what I want to point out, it's kind of hard to see, but if you take the people who are sailing today, all of us in this room, and you go back 30 years to that peak period, right? How old were we? I was a teenager, young adult. I was a kid. Were you? Okay, well some of you are older than me. The bottom line is that today's sailors were teens when popularity peaked. Teens, young adults, right? So what we exhibit as folks in this room, all dedicated to this market, even though the market is down, is a huge amount of devotion. So what I'd like to do today is I'd like to boil into what devotion is all about. But before we can do that, we really do have to confront some significant challenges, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Now when you want to change, you really need to know what you're going to measure if you're going to change. That's one of the things that I realized as I was writing this book, is that we've all read blogs and the discussion threads and magazines that have talked about the decline of the sport and therefore the decline of the industry. And there's been all sorts of blame pointing, right? Somebody didn't do this or somebody did this. And at the end of the day, what we have is not enough people enjoying what we know we like, right? So the question is, what are we going to try to measure in order to expose more people to this, in order to bring some popularity to sailing again? Are we going to measure, and I'll point out what's happening on the slide, acorns, kids, the number of kids we bring to it? Are we going to measure strength of a tree, skills, or are we going to measure the health of the forest? It's the forest for the trees exercise. Think about that metaphor, and we'll come back to it in just a minute. So there are a whole bunch of things that we think prevent people from sailing, and I'm going to list them. Too hard, unclear, expensive, elitist, too busy, not kid-friendly, irrelevant, uncool, better options, scary, and can't swim. I'm serious about can't swim. I'm on the board at the not-for-profit Milwaukee Community Sailing Center, and we put thousands of kids into boats every year, but one of the key criteria is they need to be able to swim before they get there. It really is something we have to be able to deal with. So we actually are lined up with folks that can help kids learn how to swim so they can come climb on JYs and Opties. It is really an issue, but frankly, it's not the one that we're going to confront. What I'm going to try to do is dispel some myths around all of these things that we think are in the way of people sailing. Okay? You with me so far? Let's start with too hard. This is my favorite one. And if you take anything away from this conversation, I want you to change something you're doing. And I'm going to be very clear about what it is. The fact is, more than 60% of sailors have between 20 and 40 years of experience. Raise your hand if you fit into that category. Thank you. And when you ask them why they stick with it, it's not because it's easy. Why the hell would we still do it if it was easy? It's because it's challenging. It's interesting. It holds on to us. So, slide turned funny. What this says is, why make it seem easy when the reason that we do it is that it's not? Remember that. Let's see if these slides come back. All right, let's talk about high costs. Now here's some data. You'll like this data. Probably some of you will disagree with it. I've been interviewed many times, and one of the constant questions that I'm getting is, boy, sailing is just way too expensive. People can't afford to get into it anymore, right? The mean club membership in the United States is $50 a month. That's not my number. That's from U.S. Sailing's 2007 survey of yacht clubs. You imagine that? I'm spending $70 a month on my data plan on this phone, and there are 4 of these in my family. Low-cost sailing is as good as high-cost sailing. In fact, there's no avidity disparity. You know what that means? people like it just as much when it's cheap as they like it when it's expensive. In fact, there's a lot